She never said a word. That is the part I keep coming back to. That is the part that stayed with me. Long after everything else had settled. She never raised her voice. She never looked at me with coldness in her eyes. She never said, "You are not welcome here." She never said anything at all. She just stopped setting a place for me at the table. The first time it happened, I thought it was a mistake. An oversight. Caroline was a busy woman. She worked full-time. She had 2 young children to manage, and a husband who traveled for work, and a household that demanded more of her than she ever complained about. These things happen. A person gets distracted. A person forgets. So I went quietly to the kitchen. I took a plate from the cupboard. The cupboard I had always known, the one with the small chip on the corner shelf. From the time James dropped a pot when he was 12 years old. I took a plate and a set of cutlery, and I came back to the dining room, and I set my own place at the table. Caroline was in the kitchen when I did it. She did not come to the doorway. She did not say, "Oh, Edith, I'm so sorry. I don't know how I forgot." She just stayed in the kitchen. And something about that staying, that particular, deliberate staying, told me that it had not been a mistake at all. I set my plate down carefully. I pulled out my chair, the one I always sat in, the one to the left of where Walter used to sit at the head of the table. Before he passed, I sat down. I folded my hands in my lap, and I looked at the empty chair at the head of the table. And I thought, something is happening here. Something quiet and serious. And I am going to have to decide how to carry it. That was the beginning. That one missing plate. On an ordinary Tuesday evening in October. No words. No argument. No dramatic moment. Just the quiet, deliberate absence of one plate. A table where I had eaten 1,000 meals. Let me tell you the whole story. Let me take you back to before the beginning, so that you understand what that table meant. Because the table is not just a table. It never was. My name is Edith. I am 69 years old. I have 2 children. James, who is 44, and Ruth, who is 41 and lives far away with her own family. I have 2 grandchildren. Sophie, who is 8 years old and has the most serious face of any child I have ever known, and Thomas, who is 6 and has never once sat still for longer than 4 minutes in his entire life. And I had Walter. Walter was my husband for 43 years. He passed away 4 years ago, and I still have conversations with him in my head on difficult days. Not because I have lost touch with reality, but because 43 years of talking things through with someone does not simply stop. Because the someone is gone. The habit of turning to them, of hearing their voice answer you, that does not end. It just becomes quieter, more internal. Walter and I met when we were both 23 years old, at a dinner party hosted by mutual friends. He sat across from me at a table. I always remember this detail, because the table was where we began, and he spent the entire evening asking me questions, and actually listening to the answers. Not the polite, nodding kind of listening that people do when they are waiting for their turn to speak. Real listening. The kind where the other person's words go somewhere inside you and stay. I fell in love with him over that dinner. Over a table. We married 2 years later and we moved into a small flat, and then, when the children came, into a proper house. It was not a grand house. It was a decent-sized terraced house in a quiet street, with 3 bedrooms and a garden that needed more attention than we ever quite managed to give it, and a dining room with a bay window that faced the street. The dining room was my favorite room, not because of anything expensive in it. The furniture was ordinary. A solid oak table that Walter had bought second-hand and sanded down and polished himself. 6 matching chairs that had taken us 3 months to find in the right style and price range. A sideboard along one wall where we kept the good crockery and the photograph albums, and a small wooden clock that Walter's mother had given us as a wedding gift. But what I loved about that room was what happened in it. Every single day of our family life happened around that table. Breakfast on school mornings. Rushed and slightly chaotic. The children still half asleep. Walter reading the newspaper. Sunday lunches that took the whole morning to prepare and the whole afternoon to eat, because nobody wanted to be the first one to push back from the table and break the warmth of it. Birthday dinners with the good crockery out and candles on the table that Thomas, even now, insists on blowing out even when it is not his birthday. Report card evenings when James or Ruth would come home from school and we would sit together and talk about what had gone well and what needed more work. Always gently, always honestly, always around that table. Arguments happened around that table too. I do not want to pretend otherwise. Walter and I were not a couple who never argued. We argued occasionally, the way couples who love each other do, with heat and then with repair, never with cruelty. And those arguments happened at the table too, because that was where we dealt with things in our family. Not in separate rooms. Not in cold silences that stretched across the house. At the table. Face to face. Until we had found our way through. Walter always said that the table was where a family stays a family. He had grown up in a household where meals were eaten in front of the television, each person in their own corner of the room, and he had always felt that something important was missing in those mealtimes. When we started our family, he said, "I want us to eat together, every evening, at the table," and we did. For as long as the children were at home, we did. James grew up at that table. He did his homework there when he was small, before he had a proper desk in his room. He carved his initials into the underside of the table when he was 7, thinking we would not find it, We found it, and Walter was angry for exactly 10 minutes before he started laughing. The carving is still there. J.A.H. James Arthur Hayward. I run my finger over it sometimes, when I am setting the table alone. He met Caroline when he was 36. He brought her to the house for Sunday lunch, the way he had always brought people who mattered to him. I cooked a proper lunch. A roast, vegetables, a pudding. I set the table with the good crockery, which is my way of saying that someone is worth the good crockery. Caroline was poised. She was the kind of woman who carries herself with a self-assurance that makes other people sit up slightly straighter in her presence. She was not cold. She laughed at Walter's jokes and she complimented the food genuinely, not in the polite, throwaway way. She asked James questions about his childhood and listened to the answers with what seemed like real interest. But she sat at the table in the way of someone who is visiting, rather than arriving. There is a difference, if you know to look for it. Visiting means you are comfortable but contained. Arriving means you expand into the space. You relax your shoulders. You start to belong to the room as much as the room belongs to you. Caroline sat beautifully and ate graciously and was charming company. But she was visiting. I told myself it was natural. First time at someone's family home. Of course you hold yourself a little careful. Of course you do not fully arrive. That takes time. That takes meals. Many meals. Walter liked her. He told me so after she and James had left. He said, "She's sharp, Edith. She will keep that boy of ours from getting too comfortable." Walter had always worried that James was the kind of person who could drift if he was not properly stimulated. Caroline, Walter felt, was exactly the kind of woman who would not allow drifting. He was right about that. And right about other things too. Though perhaps not in the way he meant. James and Caroline married 2 years later. Walter was still alive then. Just. He had been ill for several months by the time of the wedding, though we were still optimistic in that way that people are when they are not yet ready to stop being optimistic. He danced with me at the wedding. Slowly, carefully, because of his hip. But he danced. I rested my head on his shoulder and he held me and we danced in a way that people dance when they know it might be one of the last times. He died 14 months after the wedding. Heart failure. In the end, though it had been a long and winding road to that conclusion. He passed early on a Monday morning, quietly, the way he had lived, without fuss, without drama, without needing to make a scene of it. I was alone in the house after he died. James and Caroline came every weekend. My daughter Ruth called every day from far away. Neighbors brought food. Friends called. The community of care that comes when someone dies is real and genuine, and I was grateful for every part of it. But the evenings were long and quiet in a way that I could not have predicted and still cannot fully describe. Every evening I would walk into the dining room, and I would look at that table, and I would feel the absence of Walter in a way that was almost physical. Not at the head of the table, where his chair was, but everywhere. In the room, in the air, in the ordinary, daily ritual of setting two places instead of one. A ritual I had performed every evening for 43 years and now had no reason to perform at all. I started eating at the kitchen counter. For about 6 months after Walter died, I did not eat at the table at all. It was too large, too quiet, too full of him. And then one Sunday, James and Caroline came for lunch, and I set the table properly. All four of us. And Sophie, she was 4 then, climbed up onto Walter's chair without being asked and sat there with her small hands on the table and looked at me with her serious face and said, "Grandma, what's for lunch?" And something clicked back into place. Something essential. After that, I ate at the table again. Every evening. Because Walter had always said that the table was where a family stays a family. And even alone, I was still part of a family. I was still Edith. And I was still here. James suggested, about 2 years after Walter died, that it made sense for him and Caroline and the children to move in with me. I want to be careful about how I describe my feelings at the time, because my feelings were complicated in a way that is hard to make simple. Part of me was glad, genuinely glad. The house was large for one person. The evenings were long. Having Sophie and Thomas in the rooms upstairs. Having the sound of family in the morning and the evening. That part of me reached toward it without reservation. But another part of me, a quieter part, the part that had learned a few things in 67 years of living, had a question that I did not quite let myself form into words at the time. The question was, whose house will this be? Not legally, not on paper, but in the daily, lived sense of the word. Whose rhythms will shape the mornings? Whose preferences will fill the cupboards? Whose feeling of the space will win? When it comes down to it. I did not ask that question out loud. Perhaps I should have. Perhaps if I had, things would have gone differently. But I did not. I said yes. Come. And they came. The first year was easier than I had feared. Caroline was busy. She worked full-time. She managed the household. She raised 2 children. And she did not have the time or the energy to remake everything. The house stayed largely as it was. The dining room stayed as it was. We ate together in the evenings, all 5 of us, and it was the closest thing to the fullness of family that I had felt since Walter died. But in the second year, things began to shift. I want to try to describe it accurately, the way I would describe something I observed rather than something I experienced. Because when you are inside a thing, it is hard to see its shape, You'll only see the shape of it later, when you have stepped back far enough. Caroline began to make changes to the house. Small things first. She reorganized the kitchen cupboards. More efficiently, she said. She repainted the hallway. Brighter, she said. She bought a new rug for the living room. None of these things were unreasonable. The house had not been updated in some time. A woman who lives somewhere wants to have a hand in how it looks. I understood that. I accepted it. I told myself it was natural. But then the changes began to move toward the table. The dining room had always been used for proper meals. Sit-down meals. The table cleared and laid properly every evening. That was simply how we had always done it. Walter's wish carried on after he was gone, because it was mine too. But Caroline had grown up in a family where meals happened more informally. On laps in the living room, in front of the television, each person eating when they were hungry rather than all together at the same time. Neither way is wrong, but they are very different. And two people who have very different ideas about what mealtime means cannot easily share one table without somebody. It started with the weekdays. Caroline began serving the children's meals earlier. Their tea time, she called it, so that they ate before James came home from work, which meant that by the time James was home and dinner was ready, Sophie and Thomas had already eaten and the meal was just for the adults. Just for James and Caroline and me. And for a while, it was the three of us, round the table. And it was not warm, exactly, but it was functional. It was civil. It was fine. But then James started coming home later. His work had expanded. A new project. More responsibility. He was often not home until the children were already in bed. And so the evening meal became just Caroline and me. Those evenings were difficult in a way that I found hard to name, even to myself. Caroline was not unkind. She put food on the table. She sat across from me. But the quality of the silence between us was a particular kind. The kind that comes not from two people who are comfortable enough not to need words, but from two people who do not know what to say to each other, and are both aware of it. I tried. I asked her about her day. I asked about the children, about her work, about her friends. She answered. She answered politely, even sometimes with warmth. But she did not ask back. The conversation, every evening, was one-directional. I gave. She received. And I went to bed each night feeling as though I had been talking to myself. One evening, Caroline brought a plate of food and set it on the kitchen counter. Just one plate, clearly for herself. She said, "I think I'll eat in here tonight. Edith, I've got some things to catch up on." She pulled out her phone and propped it against the fruit bowl, and she ate at the counter, looking at her screen. Uh, I was already sitting at the dining room table. I ate my meal alone that evening. In the dining room. At the table where Walter and I had eaten together for 43 years. And I looked at the empty chairs around me, and I thought of all the evenings I had eaten here after Walter died. Before James and Caroline and the children moved in. All those quiet, solitary evenings. And I thought, this is the same, except it is somehow lonelier. Because before, I was alone because there was no one to be with. Now, there is someone in the house, and I am still alone. I did not say anything, and that was perhaps my first mistake. Because when you do not say something, when you choose a piece of silence over the discomfort of honesty, you send a message without knowing it. You send the message that this is acceptable, that this is something you will tolerate. And once something becomes acceptable, it becomes normal. And once something becomes normal, it becomes the way things are. The evenings at the kitchen counter became more frequent. And then one night, Caroline ate in the living room while watching something on the television. And another night, she fed the children early and ate with them in the kitchen before I had even come downstairs for the evening. And the dining table sat empty on weekday evenings more often than it was used. I began to feel the loss of it in a way that I could not explain to anyone who had not grown up around a table the way I had. It was not just the eating. It was the ritual. The deliberate act of sitting together and sharing food and being present with each other at the same time in the same place. Walter's wish. The thing he had insisted on because he had grown up without it and understood what it cost. And it was being quietly undone. One empty weekday evening at a time. The first time she set the table for 4 instead of 5 was a Saturday. A Saturday. A day when James was home. A day when there was no reason for the rush, each on their own informality of a busy weekday. A Saturday when she had cooked a proper meal. I could smell it from upstairs. Something with herbs and something baked. A proper sit-down meal. I came downstairs at the usual time. I walked into the dining room. 4 places. James, Caroline, Sophie, Thomas. I stood in the doorway for a moment. I counted. I am not sure why I counted. I could see perfectly well that there were 4 places. But I counted anyway. 4. I went to the kitchen. I took a plate from the cupboard. The one with the chip on the corner shelf, from when James dropped a pot at 12 years old. I took cutlery. I went back to the dining room, and I set my own place at the table. Caroline did not come to the doorway. James did not know. He came in from the garden where he had been with Thomas, and he sat down, and we all had dinner, and it was a pleasant enough evening, and I said nothing, and nothing was said. But I lay awake that night for a long time. It happened again 2 weeks later, and then the week after that. Each time, I went quietly to the kitchen, Each time I took a plate and cutlery. Each time I set my own place at the table. And each time Caroline remained in the kitchen until everything was on the table and we were all seated. And she never acknowledged it, and I never mentioned it, and the meal proceeded as though everything was perfectly ordinary. But it was not ordinary, and we both knew it. I want to try to explain to you what it feels like, that particular situation, when something is happening that everyone can see but no one will name. It has a texture to it, a kind of tightness in the air that you cannot quite escape no matter what room you are in. You start to question yourself. You start to wonder whether you are reading too much into things, whether you are being oversensitive, whether you are the problem rather than the pattern. I went through that period of self-questioning. I asked myself whether I was simply too attached to a ritual, whether the world had moved on and I had not moved with it, whether Caroline was simply a different kind of woman with a different set of customs, and whether my insistence on reading meaning into a plate was simply the stubbornness of an old woman who did not know how to adapt. But then I would think of it from the outside. I would imagine someone describing this to a friend. She has lived in this house for 40 years. She has eaten at this table for 40 years. And every time the table is set, her place is missing. Every time. Not once. Not occasionally. Every time. And I knew it was not my imagination. I called my daughter Ruth one evening. Ruth, who was far away, who called me every Sunday, who always said exactly what she thought without softening it more than necessary. I told her what had been happening. I described it carefully, as accurately as I could, including the parts where I had set my own place. I told her I was not sure what to do. Ruth was quiet for a moment after I finished, and then she said, "Mum, you should not have to set your own place at your own table." I said, "I know," she said. "Have you talked to James?" I said. "No," she said. "Why not?" And I thought about that. I thought about why not. And the answer I found, when I searched for it honestly, was this. Because talking to James meant making James choose. Between me and his wife. Between his mother's feelings and his marriage. And I had seen what those choices cost people. I had watched other families tear at the seams over exactly this kind of thing. And I did not want to be the force that tore at James's seams. I said to Ruth, "Because I don't want to put him in the middle," she said, after a pause. "Mom, he is already in the middle. He just doesn't know it yet." She was right. She often is. I said I would think about it. And I did think about it. But the thinking did not lead anywhere for a while. Because thinking and acting are different skills. And in that period of my life I was much better at the first than the second. Meanwhile, the missing place continued. And something else began to happen. Something that I had not quite anticipated. It began to affect the way I moved through the house. I started to time my appearances carefully, coming downstairs only when I was certain the kitchen work was done, so that I was not in Caroline's way. I started eating more quickly so that I could clear my things before she wanted to clear the table. I started asking permission for small things that I had never needed to ask permission for. Is it all right if I use the kitchen this afternoon? Will you be needing the dining room this evening? I was asking permission to exist in my own home. Oh, and the most painful part was that I was the one doing it. Not because Caroline had told me to. She had never said, "Ask before you use the kitchen." She had never said, "I need the dining room this evening." Edith. She had simply made the space feel less mine, gradually, over time, until I had internalized the diminishment and started enforcing it on myself. That is how these things work. The most effective displacement does not require cruelty. It does not require raised voices or cruel words. It requires only a sustained, quiet message, delivered through small daily actions, through a plate not set, through a kitchen entered and not invited into. A sustained, quiet message that says, "This space is not quite yours." And if you hear it long enough, you start to believe it. The grandchildren were my lifeline during those months. Sophie, with her serious face and her careful questions. Thomas, with his inability to sit still and his bottomless need to show me things. Every drawing, every Lego creation, every small insect he found in the garden and brought and kept in his small hands to show to Grandma Edith before Thomas released it back outside. Thomas, especially, never noticed the politics of the table. He simply sat wherever he wanted to sit, which was usually next to me, and he talked constantly about whatever was in his head, and he was a complete and perfect antidote to the silence. Sophie noticed more. Children who are old enough to understand the shape of things, but not old enough to understand why, notice everything. She watched Caroline and me with those careful eyes of hers. One evening, she came to my room, not very politely, as I had taught her, and waited until I said, "Come in." And she sat on the edge of the chair by the window and she said, "Grandma, do you and Mommy not like each other?" I looked at this 8-year-old child with her father's eyes and her own particular seriousness, and I chose my words with more care than I have chosen many things in my life. I said, "Your Mommy and I are still getting to know each other properly. Sometimes that takes a long time." She considered this. She said, "How long?" I said. "As long as it takes," she nodded. She seemed to find this acceptable. And she said, "I always put a place for you when I set the table." I looked at her. She said it the way children say important things, without drama, without awareness of the weight of it, simply as a fact. I said, "I know you do, my love." She got up, kissed me on the cheek, and went back to her room. I sat for a long time after she left, and I thought, This child has seen everything. This child has been watching. And this child has told me, in her 8-year-old way, that she knows what has been happening. And she does not think it is right. Oh. And I thought, if Sophie can see it, James must be able to see it. He must. Unless he has been choosing not to. Christmas came. In our family, Christmas had always been at our house. Walter had insisted on it from the very first year we were married, and after 40 years, it had become simply the way things were. Our table, our house, our Christmas. Ruth and her family would come from far away. Friends occasionally joined us. The house would be full and warm and loud in the way that Christmas is supposed to be. After Walter died, I had wondered whether Christmas would move, whether James and Caroline would want to host it at their own place before they moved in with me. But it had stayed at our house, at my house, and I had been glad. This was the third Christmas since James and Caroline and the children had moved in, and I had no reason to think it would be different from the previous two. Ruth was coming, her husband David and their teenage son Nathan, James and Caroline and the children, and me. I began preparing in early December. I started a list. The same list I had been making for 30 years, adjusted slightly each year depending on who was coming. I planned the menu. I thought about the table, how many leaves to put in to extend it, which tablecloth to use, whether to use the tall candles or the shorter ones in the glass holders that Sophie liked to look at. I had always laid the Christmas table myself. It was my ritual, the way the garden was Walter's ritual. I would put on some music and take out the good crockery and the Christmas linens, and I would lay each place with the same care that I laid every place at every ordinary meal, multiplied, because Christmas deserved that care, because the table, at Christmas especially, was where the family sat and knew that it was a family. 2 weeks before Christmas, Caroline said something at dinner, a weekday dinner, one of the ones where I had set my own place before sitting there. She said it lightly, casually, the way she said most things that were not casual at all. She said, "I've been thinking about Christmas this year. I'd like to try something a bit different, more relaxed, buffet style, maybe, so people can eat when they're ready rather than all sitting down together." James looked up from his food. He said, "Really?" She said, "I think it would be less stressful. For everyone." I looked at my plate. Less stressful. A buffet. People eating when they are ready. Not together. Not around the table. Not in the way that Walter had always insisted on, and that I had carried on after him, and that had been the shape of Christmas in this family for 4 decades. I said, and I kept my voice very steady when I said it. "That would be quite a change," Caroline said, pleasantly. "Change can be good, Can it? James said nothing. He looked between us the way he had been looking between us for a year. That cold, helpless look of a man who understands that something is happening but does not know what to do about it. I said, "Of course," and I looked back at my plate. And in that moment, something changed inside me. Something that had been building quietly for months. All those missing plates. All those kitchen doorways I had not entered. All those permissions I had asked for things that should not have required permission. All of it came together into one clear, steady feeling. Not anger. I want to be clear about that. Not bitterness. Not self-pity. Just clarity. The clarity that comes when you have been telling yourself a thing is fine for so long, that you have used up the last of your willingness to tell yourself it is fine. I excused myself from the table. I walked to the hallway. I put on my coat and my shoes and I went out into the garden. It was cold. Early December cold. That particular English cold that is damp as well as cold. The kind that gets into your bones. I stood in the garden and I looked at the rose bushes that Walter had planted along the back fence and I breathed. And then I did something I had not done enough of in the past year. I talked to Walter. Not out loud. Internally. The way I had been talking to him since he died. In the private, continuous conversation that grief becomes when it has nowhere else to go. I said, "Walter, I don't know what to do. I am disappearing. Not all at once, but slowly, one small thing at a time. I am becoming less present in my own home, in my own life. And I have been letting it happen. And I don't know whether that is patience or cowardice or something in between." And then I stood there and I listened. To the cold air. To the distant sounds of the street. To the silence of the garden where Walter had worked with his hands every weekend for 30 years. And what I heard. In the silence. In the cold. In the particular quality of being alone in a place you have loved for a long time. Was something very simple. Be present, Edith. Just be present. In your own life. In your own home. At your own table. Stop making yourself small so that other people can feel large. Be present. I went back inside. I hung up my coat. I walked into the kitchen, where Caroline was washing up, and I said, clearly and calmly, "Caroline, I need to talk to you about Christmas." She turned around. I said, "The Christmas table is not something I'm willing to change. Not to a buffet. Not this year. The table is how we do Christmas in this family. It was how Walter wanted it done, and it is how I want it done, and I would like it to stay that way." She looked at me. A long, assessing look. I said, "I understand that you do things differently. I understand that you have your own ways and your own preferences. And I have tried, I genuinely have tried to make room for those preferences. But this is my home, Caroline, and Christmas at this table is something I am not able to make room around. Silence. She said, "You've been very quiet about things, Edith, for a long time." I said, "I know. That was a mistake." She said nothing. I said, "I would like us to talk. Really talk. Not around things. About all of it. The table. The meals. The way things have been this past year. I think it is time." She set down the dish she was holding. She turned fully toward me, and she said, after a long moment, "All right." We sat at the kitchen table, not the dining room table. The kitchen table, which is smaller and plainer and somehow felt more appropriate for a conversation that needed to be honest rather than ceremonial. Caroline made tea. She made it properly. Leaves, not bags, the way I had always made it. I noticed that she knew how I made it, that she had been paying that kind of attention without my knowing. It told me something. Not everything, but something. We sat across from each other, and I spoke first. I spoke carefully and I spoke truthfully, but without accusation. Not you did this and you did that, but I felt this and I noticed that. There's a difference, and the difference matters. Because you did this invites defense. I felt this invites conversation. I told her about the plates. I told her what it had felt like to walk into the dining room and find 4 places instead of 5. I told her about going to the kitchen to fetch my own plate. Not angrily, just as a fact, so that she understood that I had noticed it every time and had said nothing. I told her about the permissions I had started asking for. I told her about moving through the house like a guest. I said all of it quietly and without dramatics. She listened. She did not interrupt. She held her cup of tea and she listened. When I finished, she was quiet for a while, and then she said, "I know I've been doing it." I waited. She said, "The plates. I know I've been doing it. And I don't." I told myself it wasn't deliberate, that it was just because I was distracted or in a hurry but that wasn't true. She stopped. She looked at her cup. It was deliberate. Not in a planned way. Not with any thought behind it. But deliberate the way things are deliberate when you're feeling something you haven't named yet and the feeling is coming out in the things you do. I said, "What were you feeling?" She looked up, and for the first time in years I had known Caroline. Careful, self-possessed, composed Caroline. She looked uncertain. She said, like I couldn't find my place. Like no matter what I did, this was always going to be your home. Your table. Your way. And I was always going to be the one who came after. The one who was allowed to be here. She paused. I know how that sounds, given whose house it actually is. But that's what it felt like. I thought about that. I turned it over carefully, because I wanted to understand it, not just respond to it. I said, tell me more about that. About not finding your place. She said, and this surprised me, the depth of it. She said that she had moved a great deal in her childhood, that her parents had separated when she was 9 and she had spent her growing up years between 2 houses, neither of which had ever fully felt like hers. She said that when she married James and they bought their flat, it had been the first place she had ever lived that was genuinely, unambiguously hers. That she had loved that flat with a feeling she had not entirely expected. She said that when they moved into my house, she had thought she could build that same feeling, that she could make it hers in time. But instead, everywhere she looked, she could see me. She could see Walter. She could see the initials carved into the underside of the dining table and the chip on the corner shelf and the Christmas linens that had been used for 30 years. She could see a whole life that was not hers and could not become hers, no matter how much she rearranged. And so she had started too. She searched for the right word to mark the edges, to draw a small line around what was hers and what was mine. And the plates had been one of those lines. When she finished, I sat with what she had said for a moment, and I felt something unexpected. I felt sorry for her. Not in a condescending way. Not in the way that people say they feel sorry for someone when what they mean is that they think the person is wrong. But genuinely sorry. Because what she was describing, the childhood of no fixed place, the hunger for somewhere that was simply, plainly, inarguably hers. I understood that. I had built my whole life around the opposite of that, around rootedness and permanence and the steady certainty of one table in one home. And I understood, for the first time, what it must have felt like to come into that and not be able to find her footing in it. I said, Caroline, I'm sorry. Not for the house being mine. I can't be sorry for that, but for not understanding sooner what you were carrying. She looked at me. I said, and I need you to understand something too when you take away my place at the table. Even quietly, even with that cruelty, you are taking away something that is as essential to me as your flat was to you. That table is not just furniture. It is 40 years of my life. It is every meal Walter and I ever sat down to together. It is James's initials in the wood. It is the shape of every Christmas morning I have ever known. I paused. When I go to set my own place, I am not making a political statement. I am just trying to still exist in my own life. She blinked, and I saw the moment it landed in. The real meaning of it. The full weight of what had been happening from my side of it. She said, I didn't think of it that way. I said, I know you didn't, she said. I didn't think about what it cost you. I was so focused on what it was doing for me that I didn't think about what it was doing to you. We sat in silence for a moment. The kitchen was quiet. The tea had gone cold. Outside, the street was dark and still. I said, "Can we try again?" With more honesty this time. Both of us. She nodded. She said, "Yes. I think." "Yes," I said. And Christmas at the table, she almost smiled. She said, "Yes. Christmas at the table." We did not hug. We were not quite there. But she looked at me. Really looked at me. In a way that felt different from any time she had looked at me before. Like something that had been opaque between us had become, very slightly, more transparent. And I went to bed that night feeling something I had not felt in a long time. Not happiness, exactly, but honesty. And honesty, when it has been missing for a while, feels like fresh air. James found out that night. Caroline told him after she and I had talked. After I had gone to bed. She told him all of it. The plates, the permissions, the way the house had shifted over the past year. And James, my son, who had been choosing not to fully see what was in front of him because seeing it would have required doing something about it. James finally saw it. He came to my room the next morning. He knocked and waited, the way I had raised him to do. And he came in and he sat in a chair by the window and he looked at his hands for a long time before he spoke. He said, "Mum, I am so sorry." I looked at my son. He was 44 years old and he had his father's hands and his father's habit of looking at them when he was ashamed of something. Walter used to do the same thing. Look at his hands when he could not look at you. I said, "You knew something was wrong," he said. I knew something was off. I told myself it was just adjustment. That it takes time when people live together. I told myself it wasn't as bad as it looked. I said, "It was as bad as it looked," he said. "I know." I said, "James, I don't want an apology." Well, yes, I do want an apology. But what I want more is for it not to happen again. What I want is to be a person in my own home. Not the guest. Not a shadow. A person. He said, "You are a person. Mum, you are the reason this house is what it is. You are the reason any of us know how to sit down together at a table and be a family." I said, "Then let me be that. Let me be present. Don't look away when things are happening that should not be happening." He said, "I won't. I promise." I said, "Your father would be disappointed in you, James. Not in who you are, but in this particular thing. He would be disappointed that you let it go as long as you did." He looked up at me, and I could see it hit him. The weight of what Walter would have thought. what Walter would have done. Walter, who had never looked away from a hard thing, who had always sat at the table and faced it directly. Jane said, "I know." He reached across and put his hand over mine, the way his father used to. The gesture was so familiar, so exactly Walter, that I had to close my eyes for just a moment. I said, "All right, now tell me what you want for Christmas dinner and I'll start the shopping list." He laughed. Not a big laugh, but real. And that was enough. Oh, the weeks that followed were not perfect. Caroline and I did not suddenly become natural companions. We were still two women with different histories and different habits and different ways of being in the world. And those differences did not dissolve because we had sat at a kitchen table and been honest with each other. Differences like that take longer. They require more than one conversation. They require patience and daily practice and a willingness to get it wrong sometimes and try again. But something had changed. Something structural. She set my place at the table again. Every day. Without exception. Not with the particular warmth that Sophie said it with. Sophie, who always made sure my water glass was filled and my chair was pulled out slightly, with the grave attentiveness of a child who is making a point. But Caroline said it. Every evening. 5 places. Mine included. And I stopped asking permission to be in the kitchen. I went back to the kitchen the way I had always gone to the kitchen. Because it was my kitchen, and I wanted a cup of tea, and that was reason enough. If Caroline was there, we sometimes talked. Cautiously, at first. Carefully. But the carefulness began to ease as the weeks passed. There were mornings when we were both at the counter at the same time and we talked about small things. The children's school, something we had seen on the news, what was needed from the shops. And the talking was natural in a way it had never been before. I think that is what honesty does when it is handled carefully. It does not make things instantly easy, but it removes the particular strain of pretending. And pretending is exhausting. You don't know how exhausting it is until it stops. Ruth came for Christmas with David and Nathan. She arrived on the 23rd and she walked through the front door and she looked around the house and then she looked at me and she raised an eyebrow. That Ruth eyebrow. The one that says everything in a fraction of a second. I gave her the smallest nod. Her expression changed to something softer. She hugged me. She said quietly, "Good, Mom." Christmas dinner was at the table. The extended table, with all its leaves put in, covered with the Christmas linen I had used for 30 years, with the candles Sophie had chosen. The tall ones, the ones that last through the whole meal, and the good crockery that means someone is worth the good crockery. 7 places. James and Caroline and Sophie and Thomas. Ruth and David and Nathan. And me. I laid the table myself, the way I always had. I put on music and I took out the crockery and I laid each place with the same care I had always brought to it. And when I came to my own place, my place, to the left of where Walter used to sit, I set it down and I smoothed the napkin beside it and I ran my finger over the tablecloth for a moment. And then Sophie appeared in the doorway in her Christmas dress, very serious, and she said, "Grandma, can I put the candles out?" I said, "You can put the candles out." She came in and she placed each candle with great deliberateness in the holders along the center of the table. Then she stood back and inspected her work. Then she looked at me and said, "Good," I said. "Very good." She went back upstairs. I stood for a moment alone in the dining room, looking at the table. 7 places. Candles waiting to be lit. Good crockery. The wooden clock on the sideboard. Ticking. I said, quietly, in the way I had been saying things to Walter for 4 years. 7 places. Walter. Our table. And the clock ticked. And the house was warm. And the smell of Christmas lunch was coming from the kitchen. And downstairs, Thomas was demanding to know how long until dinner in a voice that could be heard from every room in the house. It was not perfect. Nothing is perfect. But it was real, and it was ours, and I was there. Fully, entirely, unapologetically there. Seated at my own table. It is December again now. A year on from that Christmas. The table is being set for dinner as I write this. Or rather, as I remember this. I can hear the sound of it from the dining room. The small, familiar sounds of plates being placed and cutlery being laid and a chair being pulled out and pushed back in. The sounds of a table being prepared for a family meal. And there are 5 places. There have been 5 places every evening for the past year. Caroline and I are not the same women we were before that kitchen conversation. We are changed by what was said and by the year that has followed. We are not yet what I would call close. We are not easy with each other the way Walter and I were easy. The way Ruth and I are easy. The way James and I are easy. That kind of ease is earned over decades. And we do not yet have decades. But we are honest. And that is more than we had before. She asks me things now. Not always. Not constantly. But genuinely. About recipes. About James when he was growing up. About how I handled something that happened with Sophie at school. She asks and she listens, and sometimes she uses what she hears. That is a small thing. But small things are how trust is built, and we are building it slowly, brick by brick. I cook in my kitchen without asking permission. I eat at my table without setting my own place. I walk into my living room and I sit in my chair and I watch whatever I want to watch on the television, and nobody looks at me as though I am in the wrong room. I am present in my own home again. And I have learned things from this year that I want to share with you. Because this story is not only mine. I know that. I know that somewhere out there, many somewheres, probably, there is someone who recognizes the missing plate, the kitchen you stopped walking into freely, the permission you started asking for things you should not need to ask for, the gradual, quiet process of being made to feel that you are too much and not quite enough all at the same time. I want to say to that person, you are allowed to exist, fully, without apology, without permission, in your own life, in your own home, at your own table. You do not have to make yourself small so that someone else can feel large. Making yourself small does not help them. It only disappears you. I learned that silence, when it is chosen out of fear of conflict, does not keep the peace. It just delays the reckoning and makes it worse when it comes. If I had spoken up sooner, gently, honestly, without accusation, perhaps the year of missing plates would have been shorter. Perhaps Caroline and I would have found our way to the kitchen table conversation much earlier, with less damage done on both sides. But we find our way when we find it. And sometimes it takes longer than it should. And that is not always a failure. Sometimes it is just the particular pace of the particular journey you are on. I learned that the people who diminish us are almost always carrying something they have not named. Caroline's missing place in my dining room was the echo of every home in her childhood that had not quite been hers. That does not excuse it, but it explains it. An explanation, when it is offered honestly, is the beginning of the bridge between people. I learned that a table is just a table, and that a table is never just a table. Both things are true. The table is wood and chairs and crockery and nothing more. And the table is 40 years of family, every meal ever shared. Walter's hands on the wood every Sunday morning. James's initials in the grain. Sophie's Christmas candles. Thomas's inability to sit still for more than 4 minutes. Both things are true simultaneously, and honoring both things, the ordinary object and the extraordinary meaning, is part of what it means to live a full and honest life. Walter used to say that the table was where a family stays a family. I believe him now more than I ever did. I hear Sophie's voice from the dining room. She is telling Thomas that he is putting the glass in the wrong place. Thomas is insisting that he is not. Caroline is saying something that makes them both laugh. James comes down the stairs and says, "Is dinner nearly ready?" "Mom, I'm starving." And I call back, 5 more minutes. James, sit down, he says. Which chair? I say. You know which chair. He does. He has always known. In the 44 years of his life, that table has always had the same answer for him. Second from the left. The one with the good view of the garden. The one next to where Walter used to sit. And to the left of that. To the left. In the chair that has always been mine. There is a plate. a napkin, a glass, a knife and a fork, placed just as I have placed them 10,000 times before. My place, set and waiting. I go in to join them.